Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Hello world, you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. We'll start off this episode with a little housekeeping. Firstly, apologies for having taken a little while in getting back to you all. I recently returned from the UK where Sage International Australia, myself as CEO, and Commodore Patrick J. Tyrrell, OBE Royal Navy Retired, SIA's Advisory Board Chairman, put together an advanced workshop on disruptive technology in the maritime domain. This event was held at Guildhall in Portsmouth, an old imperial edifice built during the time when Britannia ruled the waves. The workshop was a great success, with world-class speakers and a good high-quality crowd in attendance representing both government and industry. My thanks to Warren Edge of MAST and his team for providing the logistical support for our inaugural maritime workshop. For pictures of this event and more information, please visit our website on www.sageinternational.org.au. On another bit of news, our research assistant Ms. Shahrazad Ghairat has left us to become project assistant at the World Uyghur Congress based in Munich, Germany. We wish Shaz all the very best with her new appointment. We also hope that once she's settled, Strategicon might be able to call upon her to interview a senior official from the WUC to enlighten us on the plight of the Uyghurs in the People's Republic of China. We certainly look forward to that. Upon my return back from the UK, I was happy to discover that SIA is now recognised by the Open Think Tank Directory as one of Australia's 35 think tanks. Having struggled hard to develop SIA over the years as South Australia's only not-for-profit private think tank specialising in geopolitics, this was a welcomed milestone. And here I would like to thank our supporters, both in the great state of South Australia and elsewhere, as well as our local and international contributors for their work and their belief in SIA and its mission. On a deeply personal note, my mother, Mrs. Renate Bruni, passed away on the 2nd of July after having battled neuroendocrine cancer for 2 years. Mum and I had many adventures, one of which was the marriage to my former wife, then an Ethiopian national, whom I met while working in Abu Dhabi. Ethiopia and its culture became very much a part of our lives since 2009. I have 2 children, Gabriella, aged 7, and Caleb, who will turn 5 in September, a beautiful synthesis of their Amharic, Austrian, and Italian ethnicities. Consequently, I was heartened when learning of the rapprochement between 2 former enemies, Ethiopia and Eritrea. For the people whom I still care for back in Addis, this is a good thing. Stabilizing the Horn of Africa so that it is mostly peaceful may well bode well for other parts of the Horn. Before we start today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that Strategicon can be found on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, YouTube, and on the Sage International website, www.sageinternational.org.au. Now, on today's episode. Today we are once again joined by Colonel Sandy Wade OBE Retired. Sandy works for the UK-based Africa Advisory Partners, a group dedicated to bringing Western investment into the African continent. For those who are interested in knowing more, their website can be found on www.appib.com. Colonel Wade has also recently been engaged by the Australian-based company AusStability. With offices in the Middle East and Australia, this company's mission is to foster security and progress. Their website, for those interested in knowing more, is www.ausstability.com. Just as I started writing my introduction for this episode, I found out that ethnic troubles are brewing yet again in Ethiopia. To do justice to this episode, I thought I would read an excerpt from the Voice of America website, which will bring you all up to date. I quote, Ethiopian soldiers have taken control of major highways, government buildings, and the airport in the eastern Somali region after violence in the capital of Jigjiga left at least 29 people dead. Fighting broke out Friday after an apparent rift between local authorities and the central Ethiopian government. It is unclear exactly what led to the violence. A senior official with the region's Somali People's Democratic Party, Kadar Abdi Ismail, tells VOA that federal forces are responsible for the deaths. He blames the violence on what he calls public anger over the illegal entry of the dangerously armed troops into the city. Ismail says non-Somali ethnic communities were targeted, shops looted, buildings burned, and at least one church destroyed. Ethiopia's military has vowed to take the necessary measures to restore order in the Ethiopian Somali regional state. End quote. Even though I pre-recorded this interview a day ago, it just goes to show how fast things can move in geopolitics. But in spite of this, nothing said in this interview has been voided by this occurrence. Ethiopia is a work in progress, and new Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has much of the people of Ethiopia behind him. Let us all hope that this outbreak of tension can be decisively resolved for the betterment of Ethiopia. Welcome back, Sandy. It's great having you back with Strategicon.
Thank you very much, John.
Sandy, can you please describe for us the background of the Ethio-Eritrean conflict? What started this conflict? Was it purely internally driven, or were there external factors at play too?
I think it was largely internally driven within Ethiopia. The incorporation of Eritrea into Ethiopia officially in 1962 was never accepted by the people of Eritrea, and the struggle against Ethiopia goes back even to 10 years before that. So it was an internal issue. Obviously, there were external supporters from time to time, but in essence, it was an internal issue.
With regard to the sort of ethnic composition of both Ethiopia and Eritrea, the Tigrinya people are common to both countries. Obviously, they're in a majority in Eritrea and in a minority situation in Ethiopia. With regard to the separation, the formal separation between Ethiopia and Eritrea, what were the lasting impacts on both sides of the border with regard to the Tigrinyas who were on both sides of the border? Was it such a clear-cut divide?
I think it was clear to those in Eritrea that Eritrea was a different entity than Ethiopia, and had been historically a different entity. And so there was that separation. But there is also a very close relationship, partly through language, partly through culture, between the Tigrayan people of northern Ethiopia and the Tigrinya people of Eritrea. But of course, in neither case are they the whole group of people living in those areas. So there are others. So it's not quite as clear-cut as everybody in Eritrea speaks Tigrinya, and everybody in northern Ethiopia is a Tigrayan, and therefore they're the same thing. It's just not quite that clear-cut.
Yeah. So why has it taken so long for this conflict to get resolved?
I think because it's a family argument. If you think about family arguments, they're always more difficult to resolve because there are emotional issues emotional issues at play. And that family element of it has made it very difficult for people to appear to give in to the will of the other side. And I think that's what has changed. That's what's been made to change is that issue of, if I change, I'm giving in to your will, has been sort of taken out of the mix by I think honestly by both sides, by Prime Minister Abiy and by President Isaias.
With regard to the hot part of the conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea, the major war that was fought in 1998 was quite a devastating and wrenching experience for both countries. Can you walk us through that particular conflict, or at least some of the key points of that particular conflict for those people who aren't really across all of this?
I think the start and the finish are probably the most important. I mean, the start, it was unexpected on the part of Ethiopia. some people in Ethiopia would say that the beginning was at least helped along by a too fast reduction in the armed forces of Ethiopia, which led to an opportunity for Eritrea to make a territorial claim over areas of border between the two countries. I think the border between the two countries has never been clear. So unclear borders create conflict. And I think this is something for Africa to bear in mind for the future. There are lots and lots of unclear borders in Africa, and they create conflict. So the unclear border issues enabled a separation of thought between the two as to where things should stand, which then turned into, I think, probably actually an unintentional war. I don't think either side intended to have this war, but again, it's a family argument. And when you start the family argument, it very quickly gets out of hand. If one goes to the end of the war, again, going back to this issue of borders, Ethiopia feels it won the war. It expected to win the peace. And the outcome of the Ethiopia-Eritrea Border Commission essentially gave victory to Eritrea, saying that the borderline was where Eritrea had said it was. Again, one has to go back to the sort of history. On the Ethiopian side, there was no incentive to clearly define where the border was historically between Ethiopia and Eritrea, because they saw themselves as being more one country than two countries. And on the Eritrean side, there was, both in the Italian period and afterwards, a much more of an incentive to understand where their country was and to understand where the border was. So when it came to evidence being produced to the Border Commission as to where the line was, Eritrea produced a more convincing body of evidence. But historically, that was sort of going to happen. So then the outcome of that decision was what was so difficult for Ethiopia to accept: winning the war, losing the peace.
Well, speaking of the peace, once the 1998 war officially ended, there was a very uneasy peace between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Both countries had been accused of using armed groups against each other in a sort of ongoing proxy war. What evidence do we know of to date that the so-called breakout of peace has actually stopped both parties arming and training groups aimed at each other? Is this now something that, both leaderships in Eritrea and Ethiopia are going to get on top of as soon as they can, or is it a quiet topic that's being pushed to the side?
No, I think they've got on top of that pretty much immediately. And if one looks at the announcement that was in the press not very long ago, just a couple of days ago, that Ginbot 7 is returning to Ethiopia and has understood that there is now an opportunity for peaceful struggle, and will return very shortly, within a month, to Ethiopia, shows two things. First of all, that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has created an environment that is conducive to those who might otherwise have chosen to use armed force to turn to peaceful politics, which means they think there is something constructive to be gained by engaging in peaceful politics. So the incentive for the Ethiopian armed opposition in some cases has gone away. The incentive for Eritrea to support them has gone away. And I think if you look at it the other way around, the same thing. The Ethiopians have no incentive now to upset what has been achieved by, I'm hesitating at using the word compromise between the two, but of course there is a compromise in there, achieved by the compromise that has resulted in this really unexpected rapprochement between the two countries.
Well, if we look for a moment at external players to this decades-long conflict, what role, if any, did the People's Republic of China play? I mean, we know that China is using Ethiopia as a gateway for most of its investments in and through the East African region. It is a huge player, but as a huge economic player, it also has a strategic interest. Has it had a strategic interest in playing an overwatch with regard to the relations between Eritrea and Ethiopia?
I think not. China has, as you correctly say, enormous economic interest in Africa, enormous economic interest in Ethiopia, and they have economic interest in Eritrea. It is certainly in China's advantage that this Ethiopia-Eritrea issue has gone away, and it will create new opportunities for China, which didn't exist before. So I don't see a Chinese hand in any part of creating that rapprochement, but I certainly see a Chinese sigh of relief, perhaps small sigh of relief, that that is over, and that their economic interest will be less burdened than it was with security interests.
Yeah. There has been a lot of attention in the international press about the Ethio-Eritrean peace being one that will last. How do you see the present state of affairs? Do you think that we are beginning to see the start of a sustained stability in the Horn of Africa region?
Yeah, I think the state of frozen conflict, if frozen is the right word, I'm not sure it is, between Ethiopia and Eritrea was leaving gaps in the Horn of Africa, between the countries of the Horn of Africa, and particularly within IGAD. And those gaps were allowing external players to come and play in those gaps between nations and to cause one nation to favour another against another, etc. This rapprochement between Ethiopia and Eritrea has closed many of those gaps. So where there was a gap that people were able to push either money or arms or influence into, that gap has now been closed. And it's no longer accessible to money, arms, influence. I think the Horn of Africa, and we'll see this, I think, over the next couple of years through IGAD, the Horn of Africa will now be able to show a more joined-up approach to its neighbours than it has been able to do for the last 20 years. And I think that will probably be a very good thing for the future stability of the region. I think in terms of whether this current rapprochement is going to last, I was in Addis last week and I asked that question of nearly everybody that I met, and the answer was yes. From everybody. I didn't have a single person saying, no, this isn't going to last, for different reasons, depending on who I was talking to. But there is no doubt that there is a sort of palpable sense of relief, certainly in Addis. I mean, it's more difficult to say outside. I wasn't outside. But certainly in Addis, that this long conflict is over and that some sense has been seen between the leaderships of the two countries, and people are really looking forward to that going ahead. I met a young Eritrean who's lived in Addis for some time, who I know well, whose sister and sister-in-law had flown down from Eritrea 2 months before. He absolutely could not have envisaged that was possible. And he was very pleased.
Sandy, just for our audience, you mentioned the term IGAD. Would you be able to sort of unpack that for our audience if you can? And what role had IGAD up until this point in time in facilitating peace between Ethiopia and Eritrea? Had it had any role whatsoever officially?
Well, IGAD is the regional economic community for the Horn of Africa, the Intergovernmental Agency for Development. There are, as some will know, there are a series of regional economic communities around Africa. 8 of them are recognized, is I think the correct term, by the African Union. And those 8 form the sort of economic framework structure beneath the African Union, through which the African Union deals with Africa. Although, of course, they go directly to the member states as well. Each of those regional economic communities has a different approach, a different feel. IGAD has always been more of a political arrangement than a commercial or economic arrangement, whereas COMESA, which incorporates many more countries and incorporates some of the countries of IGAD, and this overlap between these regional economic communities is important to understand. There are many countries which are in multiple economic communities. which allows them to use different economic communities for different purposes. So IGAD has been used for political purposes more than economic purposes. Although it is an agency for development, it has concentrated on political issues much more than it has concentrated on development issues. And actually, when development partners have come with large amounts of money and said, through IGAD, we would like to do the following thing on livestock in the Horn of Africa, for instance, IGAD has found it very difficult to manage those programs because they're not really set up to manage large amounts of development aid. Yeah. But they are set up to consider political issues. So if one looks to the South Sudan conflict, IGAD has been very much a major player in looking for a political solution to that South Sudanese internal issue. IGAD also looks at Somalia. IGAD also looks at Sudan. So it looks internally. IGAD has always had a difficulty with dealing with the Ethiopia-Eritrea issue because Eritrea voluntarily left IGAD, and IGAD then didn't say, would you like to come back? That's often been blamed on the Ethiopians, who had the chair of IGAD for a long time. Yeah. But actually, if you look around, there were other neighbouring states to Eritrea who also had no great incentive to see Eritrea back inside IGAD. You know, they had a conflict or a proxy conflict of their own engaging with Eritrea. So now that this rapprochement has happened, now that Eritrea will be able to take a full part again in IGAD, IGAD will become more useful politically than it was, and it was already useful. And it will be interesting to see whether it then takes on more of an economic role, particularly perhaps in how regional trade might happen, because for the Ethiopia-Eritrea issue, there are many immediate questions on how is trade going to take place between Ethiopia and Eritrea. What is the exchange rate going to be, for instance, between the Birr and the Nakfa? Are there going to be tariffs on exports either way across the border between Ethiopia and Eritrea? So these are all issues which are still to be resolved, and over which there will have to be some form of negotiation.
Sandy, what has been the African Union's opinion of matters? I mean, obviously there must be some cause of celebration in many quarters of the AU as an organisation, but also trepidation in terms of how best to reintegrate a country like Eritrea into the family of African states. It's not that it's got a great economy. Its politics is still very much mired under the dictatorship of Isaias Afwerki. So, how does all this play out with the AU?
I haven't spoken to anybody in the AU directly about this issue, although I have spoken to people in the AU in the last week. The AU is traditionally a very welcoming organisation. They will default to allowing somebody in rather than defaulting to keeping somebody out. Right. So their position on Eritrea will be, I think, that they are naturally a member of the AU. They have continued to be a full member of the AU. And I don't think the AU will see any difficulty with dealing with Eritrea. I think, on the other hand, they would see it much more as a relief that they're able to sort of tick off one of the many sort of friction points in Africa. And they will be looking to see how they can assist Ethiopia and Eritrea through IGAD to move forward. The AU has some important sort of policies on things like welfare, education, etc., which they will continue to push through IGAD, and which will be made more successful by this rapprochement. So I think from the AU point of view, they would only see this as being a positive.
Sandy, many attribute the following factors as central to the Ethio-Eritrean peace, one of which would be the economic desperation of Eritrea, cut off as it was from Ethiopian trade. Another one would be the political turmoil among Ethiopia's leading ethnic groups, the Amhara, the Oromo, and the Tigrinya, or the Tigray people. The other would be the resignation of former Prime Minister Hailemariam Desalegn, who represented the Ethiopian political old guard, and of course the ascension of the Oromo Abiy Ahmed as Ethiopia's new Prime Minister. And then finally we have the involvement of both Saudi Arabia and the UAE in settling this dispute, owing to their substantial and growing investments in both countries. Sandy, which of these factors do you think holds primacy?
Knowing the Ethiopians very well and knowing Eritreans quite well, I don't see that either Ethiopia or Eritrea would have sold their sovereignty for a few dollars, i.e. that they would have been bought into making this change by money that has come from outside.
Right.
So I think for those who would look and say that UAE has given a large cash injection to the Ethiopian economy at a time at which it absolutely needed more foreign exchange, those who would say that has been the prime factor in this rapprochement, I think are wrong. I think the prime factor in the rapprochement is actually not that Hailemariam was one of the old guard who handed over, but actually Hailemariam was part of the new succession. And I mean, it's very interesting and important that the handover between Hailemariam and Abiy Ahmed is a first in the history of Ethiopia. I think one would be very pressed to find a time at which a leader of Ethiopia has stepped down and remained both alive and or at liberty. So this really is a change for Ethiopia. And Hailemariam is not treated as, in some way, part of a past problem. He's being treated as part of the future solution in Ethiopia. So I think that's a very important point. Hailemariam began a process of discussion with Eritrea, which allowed Prime Minister Abiy to grasp that opportunity, grasp that change, and see that it needed to be done. So I would say that the principal factor is an understanding amongst Ethiopian government figures that the status quo could not be maintained. And Hailemariam announced, you maybe remember about 2 years ago, that his government was reconsidering its policy on Eritrea. He had, I believe, some meetings in America with Eritrean counterparts while he was Prime Minister. And so that process, that understanding, I think was matched on the Eritrean side by, again, an understanding that actually it was not working to just remain as they were in a state of enmity. You know, there is much more to be gained by the new rapprochement between the two than was ever there to be gained by either side with the frozen conflict. So again, I would go back to this family argument thing, that family arguments are always unsustainable. They're always bad for the family. And the moment you get over it, there's a sort of palpable sense of relief amongst all the brothers and sisters. In this case, I would say, think the other nations of the Horn of Africa. And palpable relief amongst the children, think the people of Ethiopia and Eritrea. That issue has gone away between the two parties. So I would put it down, of course, political turmoil in Ethiopia has had a part to play in some of the decisions that have been made on how to take things forward in Ethiopia. Of course, the economic issues in Eritrea have had a part to play on how Eritrean policy has worked, and perhaps on whether the UAE should be allowed or shouldn't be allowed to come in and operate out of Assab. That brought some money in. How successful did the gold mine, the Nosan gold mine, have to be in order to shore up the economy, if that's what it's been doing? But fundamentally, this, I think, is between the leadership of the two countries.
While a strong argument can be made that Ethiopia is forging ahead politically under a new democratically inspired leader in Prime Minister Abiy, the same cannot be said for Eritrea. The dictatorship of Isaias Afwerki still holds sway over the country. What fate lies in store for him? Can he survive the democratic momentum and expectation being built up over the border in Ethiopia? Or is it all over for him and his regime?
I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think the standard international received wisdom was that he needed the conflict between the two countries in order to survive, in order to create the circumstances which would enable him to hold on to power in a quite a sort of military way. So, if that was true, then that's changed. I think for the future, one is looking at a changing Eritrea, undoubtedly. Will it change as fast as Ethiopia appears to be changing in terms of making space for opposition who have been armed and who now are saying, we don't need to be armed, we are now, we can deal with the political leadership of our country without facing them with a gun. How quickly will that follow on in Eritrea, I think, is an unknown at the moment. But I would expect that in some way it will follow on, and in some ways what Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is able to achieve over the next 2, 3, 5 years may in some ways show a way ahead for Eritrea.
What you're saying is that Ethiopia can act as a regional exemplar?
In a way, yes. I mean, there's a question there. Will it? I mean, there's nothing given about political progress. It has to be worked at. There's nothing given about stability. It has to be worked at. So it's perfectly possible that for governments, for parties to make wrong decisions which lead down the wrong lane. But I would expect over the next 5 years that Ethiopia will progress towards a different political arrangement, towards a more peaceful political arrangement. I mean, obviously, there are still significant tensions in Ethiopia, in a country of 100 million people. People are now beginning to talk 110 million. I mean, I heard that figure twice in the last 3 months. When I arrived in Ethiopia 10 years ago, people were talking about 70, 80 million. Now they're talking about 100, 110 million. In a country of 110 million people, you can't please all the people all the time. And so I think some of the, I want to call it residual, but others might say it's more than residual. Some of the residual tensions that are being seen in Ethiopia in the rural communities are a result of this very fast change that's happening, not pleasing everybody all the time. Prime Minister Abiy has made spectacular changes, some of which have threatened, if that's the right word, interest groups in all parts of the country amongst all of the ethnicities. And that's inevitable. He's making an omelette and he can't do it without breaking some eggs. So that getting to the point where those internal political issues are dealt with is going to be a long process, but hopefully it's going to be a peaceful process now.
And now we'll take our customary musical interlude. You're listening to Strategicon, the podcast of SIA.
መጀመሪያ እንዳደርግ ይፈቀድልኝና ፈጣሪ ኢትዮጵያንና ሕዝቦቿን አብዝቶ ይባርክ።
ፍቅር አበቀለ ጥላቻ ማይገፋው ጥላቻ ማይገፋው ባቢጾም ማያዣው ቢሾም ከመንበሮ ሰው ክፉ እንዳይሰራ እንዳይረክስ አገሩ ሲሆን አይደለም ወይ ንጉሥ እንዳገልጋይ ሀገር የምትሞቀው የነጻነት ፀሐይ
And that was Addis Mulat Hageran, new Ethiopian music dedicated to Dr. Abiy Ahmed. Hope Entertainment 2018. We'll now return to our interview on the Ethio-Eritrean peace with Colonel Sandy Wade. So, just continuing on this discussion, many of Ethiopia's existing internal ethnic disagreements, which have bubbled to the surface over the last few months, do you think Abiy Ahmed's abilities, his enthusiasm, will be able to keep at least, his prime ministership on top of these things? Or do you see that sort of urban-rural divide is going to be something of a chasm that can't really be filled easily by whoever runs Addis Ababa?
I think, well, first of all, it would be a mistake to imagine that Prime Minister Abiy only runs Addis. He's enormously popular, particularly amongst his own grouping, amongst the Oromo. But there is a large proportion of the Tigrayan population who see the peace with Eritrea as being a very, very significant win. So he's not just ruling from Addis. He's not just an Addis ruler. He also personally crosses over between some of the religious divides. He has been a Muslim and an Orthodox Christian and is now, I think, Pentecostalist, but certainly a modern Christian. And so he's able to cross some of those divides himself. But there are still very, very significant challenges with dealing with this population of 110 million people. So I think the really key one is the economy and the creation of jobs, moving things forward. There has always been a sort of race going on in Ethiopia between education and development. Education and industrialization is perhaps a better way to put it. Until somebody can read, they can't work in a factory which has signs which say, don't put your hand in here or you will lose it, because otherwise you have workers who don't have hands. So, but getting somebody to the point where they can read it and not having the job to offer them then becomes an issue. So there is this sort of tension, positive tension between education and development, and the two are going ahead. And I think at the moment, education, particularly tertiary education, is outrunning the jobs market, and people are coming out of tertiary education better educated and with an expectation of finding work that matches that education, and those jobs aren't there. So this I think for the near future is a very important group of Ethiopians, young Ethiopians, the educated who've been to university, who have got something to say and will say it. The other group, who one could perhaps say are in tension with them, are or perhaps not in tension with them, but it's a different issue, is the much larger group of rural youth who have not yet been educated to that point, but who do have an understanding that as the population grows, the family farm has been subdivided as far as it can be. I can carry on working for my father, my father's brother, ending up working for my brother, but that's not what I expect out of life. I'm expecting something different. So there is a huge change taking place in Ethiopia in terms of industrialization. They've just begun a process of industrial parks each of which will employ something between 60 and 100,000 people, but in a very, very different environment to one that somebody who has grown up on a farm in rural Ethiopia has known. So again, there's an enormous adjustment to take place socially in Ethiopia to understand that modern work is not the same thing as planting on a farm in rural Amhara, for instance. So for the future, I think politics is going to revolve around the economy, and it's going to revolve around the economy because the economy is what's going to provide work for people, and that's fundamentally the future sort of contest ground between political parties. I think for the political parties there is an issue about how to be positive about that.
It's interesting. I mean, I was just reflecting on what you were saying with regard to tertiary educated Ethiopians in the cities, finding it harder and harder to find meaningful work that reflects the studies that they've invested in. Well, this sounds very much like a first world problem, and if first world countries can't get on top of them, how do we expect a developing country like Ethiopia, as ambitious as it is, to get on top of it? I mean, it is a complex issue that's made even more complex in the West because, we're struggling with, integrating all these different levels of automation. The odds against finding meaningful employment for a human being is becoming less over time. How do you think this is going to play out in a place like Ethiopia where, yes, you're quite right with saying that there are all these other political, economic, social issues that need to be looked at, but if the economy is going to be a key factor in stabilizing Ethiopia, and much of what Ethiopia is looking at in the future are the same problems as a place like Australia or the UK or Germany, and, these other more advanced countries are having such a hard time figuring out what the solution is. What chance has Ethiopia got in a circumstance like that?
Well, I think in basic terms, I mean, the Ethiopian economy has got a very, very long way to run before it's anywhere near where we are. So there's enormous growth possible and going to happen. I mean, if every family in Ethiopia were to buy a new television tomorrow, there's something like 20 million televisions or 30 million televisions being required. So the scale of production, I don't think there are many families in Ethiopia that own a vacuum cleaner at the moment. When every family in Ethiopia owns a vacuum cleaner, probably 30, 40 million vacuum cleaners. So the scale is huge. But the scope for movement still in the economy is enormous. But I think more important is going to be this understanding that it's different. And I think I've had a number of discussions with groups of Ethiopian university students about what comes next, and they always have this worry about. So I finish my university, what do I do? My response to them was that my children leaving university ended up working in a bar. While looking for another job. Don't expect to walk into, because you did law, to walk into a law firm and become a lawyer. Don't have this idea somehow that your next day after finishing university is you're going to be standing up in court defending somebody. It's not going to happen that way. And I think that is a message which is difficult for Ethiopians themselves to send to Ethiopian youth because they don't have that experience. And so there is a sort of disjoint there. But if that expectation can be managed, then there is room for the economy to grow to the point where there is enough employment to look after the people of Ethiopia in terms of financing themselves successfully.
Sandy, can Ethiopia's new democracy bode well for other areas of the Horn of Africa that have been trouble-plagued for decades? And here I'm specifically referring to Somalia, and not only that, I'm specifically also referring to the Ogaden region, which is the internal area of Ethiopia that does have a very large Somali population, and it is a contested area too.
Yeah, so I think going back to my comment about papering over the cracks. Or filling in the cracks, I think it's more than papering over. The political change in Ethiopia will change the relationship between neighbours and Ethiopia. I'm not sure it will have so much of a direct feed over into a different form of politics in South Sudan, for instance, or in Somalia. Somalia has its own political arrangements. You know, it has developed over since 1990 its own political culture, its own political way of doing things. And I don't think that they are going to automatically say, oh, look, that's how the Ethiopians do things, let's do things the same way. They have a different issue. I think for the Somali region of Ethiopia, which incorporates an area called the Ogaden, but they're not the same thing. The Ogaden is a smaller region than the Somali region of Ethiopia, and Ogadenis are by no means the majority Ethiopian Somali population. What's happening in Addis, what's happening in Ethiopian politics will affect the Somali region of Ethiopia. It will be very interesting to see in the upcoming EPRDF, Ethiopian Ruling Party Congress, which is due in September, what happens with the arrangements between the 4 founding members of the EPRDF and their affiliated parties from the regions. So the Somali People's Party, will that become a full member of the EPRDF? I mean, there are discussions of the 2 possibilities. One is that the barriers will come down within the EPRDF and it will cease being a coalition of 4 parties, but will become one party. That would create some challenges in how to deal with ethnicity within the party. Alternatively, that all of the other regional affiliate parties who currently rule in the other regions of Ethiopia, in Benishangul-Gumuz, in the Afar, in Somali region, etc., will become full members of the EPRDF, and it will go from being a 4-party coalition to a 9 or 10-party coalition. That leaves the possibility of other parties joining that coalition as well, and perhaps joining with some of the extant parties. So one might imagine that it's possible for an opposition party in a region to come to some arrangement with a ruling party in that region, whereby that opposition party would then be able to take part in the politics outside of directly winning seats in their own name in a parliamentary election. So all of those things are, I think, positives, but there are huge challenges there as well.
Well, Sandy, is there anything else you'd like to add to what you've put forward so far with regard to this outbreak of peace, which I think is greatly welcomed?
Yeah, I'd say for the political parties in Ethiopia, there was there've been a whole series of extraordinary events for Ethiopia in the last couple of months, but one of them was that the Prime Minister invited all of the opposition parties to a meeting a couple of weeks ago on a Sunday, and one of the things that I believe he said to them was, looking at the 80 parties in the room, you can't compete with us in this format. If we go to another election, we will win. You have to reorganize yourselves in order to compete with us. We won't prevent you doing that. And you need to form coalitions in order to challenge us and in order to take a positive part in a future election. Wow. I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. But I think for those political parties, those opposition parties, forming those coalitions will be difficult because they have different views and approaches, largely divided between nationalists and federalists. So I could see there would be perhaps a nationalist coalition and perhaps a federalist coalition who would challenge the EPRDF in the upcoming elections. But more important than that they form those coalitions is those coalitions have something positive, constructive to say and to offer the people of Ethiopia. And so often in the past in Ethiopia, opposition politics have been about an opposite position and about if the EPRDF say they will do Y, we will do exactly the opposite. And that's not going to take Ethiopia anywhere. And so for the opposition parties, it will be very important, if they wish to get the votes of the people, that they say something in their manifestos which will demonstrably take Ethiopia towards a good place. Because while opposition parties follow a sort of negative position, it's difficult to see that people will actually vote for them. So if they want votes, they have to, I think, do a bit of hard introspection and also look very closely at what the current government are doing well and decide what part of that they would tell the people of Ethiopia they will continue. Because to say we will continue none of it, we will start again from scratch, we will throw away the constitution, isn't a very positive message that people will find easy to vote for. And if Prime Minister Abiy is able to create a circumstance in which people have a free vote, then that what is on offer for that vote will become much more important than it has done in the past.
Well, all I can say to that is that the Ethiopian opposition has a lot of homework to do.
Yep, I would agree with that.
Well, anyway, that brings us to a close. Thanks for joining us today on Strategic on Sandy.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk.
Thank you. Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to Strategicon through iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn and YouTube, and please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Until next time, goodbye.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.